Some of my favourite Doctor Who stories are from the early 1990s. The TV show had been cancelled in 1989, but every month a new full-length novel was released, carrying on the story of the Seventh Doctor and Ace. At their best, they were hugely imaginative, expanding the world of Doctor Who far beyond what it had been on screen. And the best writers have gone on to massive success elsewhere. And yet all these books are long out of print and not legally available to buy anywhere. I'm talking about the Virgin New Adventures. 61 novels were published between 1991 and 1997. I've only managed to collect 25 of them myself, as most of them are extremely expensive to buy second hand. You can find electronic copies of all of them online if you just search for the title plus PDF, so I have read most of them that way. Although of course if they ever do get republished, I will be buying the physical copies, so the author gets their due payment. The series started with the Time Worm Quartet, 4 books which all feature the same evil alien threat. Genesis by John Peel is not a great start to the range, trying too hard to be shocking with its adult scenes, which mainly feature lots of nudity and underage sex. Exodus by Terrance Dicks is much better, set in an alternate world in which the Nazis won World War II. It tackles Hitler and the Nazis in a much more mature way than the TV series ever could. Even in Let's Kill Hitler, they were mainly played for laughs. Then there's Time Worm Apocalypse by Nigel Robinson, but you can safely skip it as it's not very good and doesn't really add much. Far better is Time Worm Revelation by Paul Cornell. This really sets the standard for many of the best books in the range going forward. It's certainly one of the more experimental ones, with many scenes set in the Doctor's mind and a sentient church on the moon. But if you can handle weirdness, it's certainly one of the best. Next we have the Cat's Cradle trilogy, which is even more loosely linked, and the 3 books really have very little in common. Time's Crucible by Mark Platt introduces the plotline exploring ancient Gallifrey and hinting at the origin of the Doctor, which is further explored throughout the rest of the series. So it is pretty important. Then comes Warhead by Andrew Cartmell. This is the first of a trilogy of near-future eco-thrillers, which are dotted throughout the series. They're a good read, but they're certainly not essential for enjoying the rest of the series. Finally, we have Witchmark by Andrew Hunt, the first New Adventures novel that I actually own. Not sure why I bought it, as it's not very good, but it does at least wrap up the trilogy. Nightshade by Mark Gatiss is quite well thought of. It even got an audio adaptation by Big Finish, like several others in this range, though I haven't listened to any of them, so I can't tell you if they're any good. Personally, I'm not really a fan of this book. It's very much in the traditional mode of Doctor Who, which these novels are meant to be breaking away from. But Mark Gatiss is a decent writer, so you may enjoy it. Next we come to Love and War by Paul Cornell. And like Time Worm Revelation before it, it's an absolute classic. It's a good jumping on point for fans of the television show. It tells the story of how Ace leaves the Doctor after a shocking betrayal that is still utterly necessary, and also introduces a new companion, Professor Bernice Summerfield, Benny to her friends. A wonderful creation who has gone into star on countless books and audios of her own. Transit by Ben Aaronovitch is next. This is very much a cyberpunk novel, full of sex, drugs and swearing, and it's about as adult as Doctor Who ever gets. You get the sense that they deliberately pulled back on the adult elements after this one, which is a shame, but it's a fascinating read all the same. Then we have The Highest Science by Gareth Roberts. This is much more of a comedy, full of witty dialogue and aliens that look like human tortoises. Next is The Pit by Neil Penswick. This is generally regarded as one of the worst of the series. I don't know if I'd go that far, but frankly it is a bit of a slog. Deceit by Peter Darvell Evans is much better. This brings back an older version of Ace, who's now a battle-hardened soldier with an agenda all of her own. And this continues on into Lucifer Rising by Andy Lane and Jim Mortimore, which is full of big science fiction ideas. and is another great read. White Darkness by David A. McGinty is next, and for a change, it's not a big science fiction novel. It's actually set on Haiti during World War One, but it's not a pure historical, as it's full of voodoo zombies and Lovecraftian horror. Next is Shadowmind by Christopher Boulis, another science fiction action tale, but this one's pretty forgettable. Much better is Birthright by Nigel Robinson. This splits up the Doctor and his companions, with Benny in Victorian London and Ace on an alien planet, which is a fun experiment, and you don't see what the Doctor's up to until the next novel, Iceberg by David Banks, which also has Cybermen in it, one of the few New Adventures novels to actually use villains from the show. This actually starts something of a trend, as the next novel uses Silurians. Blood Heat by Jim Mortimer is the first of a 5-part series known as the Alternate Universe cycle, some of which fit the bill more than others. This one is set in a world ruled by Silurians, with alternate versions of many of the familiar unit characters, many of which end up dying brutal deaths. It's a grim read, but definitely worthwhile. The Dimension Riders by Daniel Blythe is next. It's much more slight and barely fits the alternate universe brief at all. Much better is The Left-Handed Hummingbird by Kate Orman. There's a lot of time travel, a lot of drug trips, and it's all very well written. Conundrum by Steve Lyons was actually the first New Adventures novel I ever picked up. You would think it's not the most accessible, but it certainly whetted my appetite, and it definitely made me want to pick up the earlier volumes to find out what I'd been missing. There's a wonderfully witty first-person narration from the villain, and parodies of genres from superheroes to Enid Blyton. And there's a great twist which ties it all back to one of the earliest episodes of the classic series. The last of the alternate universe books is No Future by Paul Cornell. This is possibly the weakest of Cornell's books, but it's still a fine read, full of great jokes and masses of continuity references. Tragedy Day by Gareth Roberts is somewhat darker than The Highest Science, but still has lots of fun satirical points to make. You can see it's definitely inspired by stories such as Paradise Towers and The Happiness Patrol. Legacy by Gary Russell is another continuity-heavy book, introducing the Ice Warriors and Paladin to the New Adventures, and expanded on their TV history with plenty of lore. Theatre of War by Justin Richards feels like a pilot for Benny's solo adventures, as it introduces her future home, the Braxitel Collection, and her future boss, the mysterious Irving Braxitel, who may or may not be the Doctor's brother. It's all very confusing. All Consuming Fire by Andy Lane is a bizarre mashup of Doctor Who with Sherlock Holmes and H.P. Lovecraft. It shouldn't work, but it really does. Blood Harvest by Terence Dix is another mashup, this time of Doctor Who with gangsters and vampires, but it doesn't work quite as well. Strange England by Simon Messingham is the first of several homages to Ghostlight. It's full of quirky characters in a mysterious house, but this one is not very good. First Frontier by David A. McGinty is a 1950s alien invasion story, which gives it a kind of retro X-Files feel. St. Anthony's Fire by Mark Gatiss is pretty forgettable. As his work on the television shows, he's much more comfortable writing for historical settings, and this one has lots of aliens on an alien planet, so it's not one of his best. Falls the Shadow by Daniel O'Mahony is another story that's clearly influenced by Ghostlight, but this one is much, much better. There's a lot of torture, so it's not one of the most fun reads, but it's certainly one of the most well written. Parasite by Jim Mortimer. I have no memory of this one. I think I must have skipped it. Warlock by Andrew Cartmell, another one of his trilogy. If you enjoyed the first one, then you'll like this. If you didn't, then you can probably skip it. Set Piece by Kate Orman is the final novel featuring Ace, and it feels like a pilot for her own series, where she travels through time and space on her own. Sadly, that series hasn't happened yet, and it was retconned anyway by the power of the Doctor. but still this is a fine ending for the character. Infinite Requiem by Daniel Blythe, it's another one I think I must have skipped. Sanctuary by David A. McGinty is a rare pure historical novel set in medieval France, and it's a crucial novel for Bernice's storyline as it gives her a tragic romance. Then we have Human Nature by Paul Cornell, the only new adventure novel that's been adapted for the TV series. The novel itself is very different to the TV episodes, Human Nature and Family of Blood. It's still got the same basic story, the Doctor becoming human, but there's a lot of different characters. The villains are almost entirely different, and it's a lot more complex. I'd say it's possibly Paul Cornell's finest work, and any Doctor Who fan should read it. Original Sin by Andy Lane begins a new era by introducing two new companions, Chris Wedge and Roz Forrester, who are Judge Dredd-style future cops fighting crime in a future megacity. It also has one of the most bizarre and unexpected appearances by a villain from the original series, which I won't spoil because it's an absolutely genius twist. Sky Pirates by Dave Stone is the final novel that I've bought in paperback. It's definitely worth picking up as there's maps, appendices, and all sorts of fancily designed extras. The author clearly wants to be the next Douglas Adams or Terry Pratchett. He's not quite in the same league, but it's still a fun read. Zampa by Gareth Roberts is another humorous one with the return of the humanoid tortoises. Toy Soldiers by Paul Leonard. I'm afraid I skipped this one as well. Head Games by Steve Lyons is a kind of sequel to Conundrum. Feature a fictional version of the Seventh Doctor, as well as bringing back most of his old companions. It's good, but not quite as good as its predecessor. The Also People by Ben Aaronovitch is a hard science fiction novel reminiscent of the work of Ian M. Banks. Full of big ideas and witty prose, definitely a highlight of the range. And next we have Shakedown by Terrance Dicks. This is a novelisation of a straight-to-DVD movie that I haven't seen, and I didn't want to spoil it. Just War by Lance Parkin. I have actually heard the Big Finish audio adaptation of this, and it's pretty grim, with Benny becoming a Nazi prisoner of war. But I do remember it being one of her better stories. Next is War Child by Andrew Cartmell, the finale of his trilogy. So if you like the others, then you'll like this one. Next is Sleepy by Kate Orman. Possibly not as effective, but still pretty good. Death and Diplomacy by Dave Stone introduces the character of Jason Kane, who becomes Benny's love interest, and a supporting character in many of her books and audios. He's basically an ordinary bloke transported to the far future, so he feels kind of like a Dave Stone self-insert. But still, it's a fun read, and certainly a lot more accessible than Sky Pirates. Happy Endings by Paul Cornell is the 50th book in the range, and to celebrate, Benny and Jason Kane get married. And the book brings back characters from every previous book in the range. There's not much of a plot, and it's incredibly self-indulgent, but if you've read the vast majority of the previous books, then you'll find it pretty enjoyable. God Engine by Craig Hinton. I don't remember reading this, so I may have skipped it. Christmas on a Rational Planet is the first Doctor Who book by Lawrence Miles, and the only one of his that I've read so far. I know that he would go on to write lots of key mythology books in the 8th Doctor Adventures. He certainly has a distinctive style about him, and it's certainly well written, if perhaps a bit overcomplicated. Revenge of the Living Dad by Kate Orman. This is one of the more light-hearted ones, but still a pretty good read. The Death of Art by Simon Booker Jones. Yeah, I'm afraid I may have skipped this one as well. Next is Damaged Goods by Russell T Davies. Whatever happened to him? It's much darker than the TV episodes he would go on to write, full of sex and drugs and violence. Very much living up to the remit of the New Adventures. And it's fascinating to read in light of his later work. Arguably it feels more like Queer as Folk than Doctor Who. So Vile a Sin by Ben Aaronovitch and Kate Orman. It's very important for the ongoing storyline as it kills off one of the regular companions. But it's full of huge events and feels very much like a season finale. Bad Therapy by Matthew Jones, not exactly essential reading, but it does bring back an old companion, as does Eternity Weeps by Jim Mortimore, shortly before killing him off. In fact, I seem to remember there being a huge body count in this one, and it also involves Benny and Jason getting divorced. So not exactly one of the more fun entries. The Room with No Doors by Kate Orman. Pretty unmemorable, not one of the best, but it's followed by Lung Barrel by Mark Platt, which feels like the big finale of the New Adventures, tying up all the Gallifreyan mythology and explaining the Doctor's backstory once and for all. And there's no mention of a timeless child at any point, so it's essential reading. Finally, we have The Dying Days by Lance Parkin. It's the final New Adventures novel, and the only one to feature the 8th Doctor. It also involves Bernie Summerfield, the Ice Warriors and the Brigadier. I haven't read it since it was available on the BBC website. But I do seem to remember it being one of the good ones. So yeah, even I haven't read all of them. The quality does vary quite a bit from book to book, though there are common themes that crop up a lot. Cyberpunk, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, sex, drugs, violence, naked companions, the Doctor committed genocide, psychological trauma, and the personification of abstract concepts like time and death. Basically, if it's written by Paul Cornell, Kate Orman, or Ben Aaronovitch, it's going to be good. You can probably add people like Mark Platt, Andy Lane, Jim Mortimer, and several others to that list. But if it's by a first-time writer who hasn't done anything since, then it's probably safe to skip it. I hope I've given you enough of a feel for what they're about to at least get you started. That's all for now, so please subscribe if you want to see more videos delving into obscure Doctor Who spin-offs. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.